Hello and welcome back to the channel. Now, if you watched the oversimplified video I did on the Emu War, then you would already know a bit, but I think this will explain in more detail about the Emu War. So yeah, let's get on with the video.
The Soldier Bear, World War II.
Ah, yes, it was a Polish bear who General, I can't remember, Forsflach, I think it was, and he basically he became the mascot of that regiment and actually managed to. I didn't actually know that this was about several species and several wars, but he would carry ammunition around and it was a real bear.
A new Polish army was setting up in the Middle East in 1942 under British command when one of the soldiers noticed a bear cub presented to them by an Iranian boy. The bear had been made an orphan after its mother had been shot by hunters. The soldiers purchased the cub, and it was taken under care by a civilian refugee in the camp. In August, the bear was donated to the 2nd Transport Company, or what would become known as the 22nd Artillery Supply Company of the Polish II Corps, and given the name Wojtek by the soldiers. And soon, he would become a morale-boosting mascot for the troops. The soldiers fed him milk from a vodka bottle, fruit, honey, and the odd beer as a reward. Wojtek was also fond of cigarettes, which he would smoke and eat, and liked to...
He would have roughly 4 cigarettes a day, according to some records from the diaries of the soldiers.
Wrestle the men, and could salute on command. When the Polish army were about to leave Egypt to enter Italy in 1943, there was a problem with Wojtek's status as an animal, and he would not be allowed to accompany the soldiers in the fighting. To get around this, the bear was officially drafted into the Polish army as a private. And
just like the little boy who was, I've forgotten his name, the 6-year-old who went into the Russian army.
Given his own paybook and serial number. During the Battle of Monte Cassino, Wojtek supported the artillerymen by carrying crates of ammunition to the men.
As I said,
one of his carers, Henryk Zakarowicz, had to leave the bear alone for the day to spot targets. Wojtek was chained near the soldiers firing artillery and started copying what the men were doing, picking up the crates and carrying them near to the cannons.
He acted very much like a toddler in that sense, which was very surprising, and from that we have learned that a lot of animals try and copy their owners and display more human, more human characteristics.
After the battle, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company made their badge a depiction of a bear holding a shell. When the war ended in May 1945, Wojtek and the 22nd were transported to Berwickshire, Scotland, and were stationed at Winfield Camp. Many of the soldiers would have to say goodbye to Wojtek, as their service would take them to other parts of the world. Following demobilization in 1947, Wojtek would live in Edinburgh Zoo, where he became popular with the locals, visited by journalists and the Polish ex-servicemen who fought with him. He would pass away in 1963 at the age of 21. The Japanese army versus an army of crocodiles. Battle of...
I would presume that this would have been in the Forgotten War, as it was called, which was an area in Asia during World War II when in the jungles of Southeast Asia, where a lot of battles took place but were never actually talked about. One of them was Hacksaw Ridge, another one the Battle of the Tennis Courts, and so on. So it's actually very... So when people actually forget about this is where most casualties from... This is where a lot of the casualties from the war actually comes from, this Forgotten War.
Bremery Island. Strange stories of World War II. The Asian saltwater crocodile is a marvel of evolution. With its prehistoric form so effective, it hasn't changed significantly in millions of years. It is the largest reptile on the planet, in some cases growing up to 23 feet in length and weighing around a massive 2,200 pounds. As an apex predator, with its armor-like thick skin and powerful bite, it makes for a most formidable opponent.
And one of the largest crocodiles to ever exist.
It is at the top of its food chain, and will fight and devour any animal that enters its territory, including monkeys, birds, turtles, and even sharks. And of all the crocodile species, the saltwater variety has the strongest tendencies to treat humans as prey. They almost seem to regard us as a tasty snack that's to be savored and enjoyed. The saltwater crocodile is an opportunistic predator, waiting for food to come its way rather than going hunting for it.
Yes.
Any animal within a salty's range on the water's edge is likely seen as food. Humans who find themselves in this dangerous predicament can end.
And often still happens it, and on some places you could just find arms washed up onto the shore of a local village because someone has been killed.
Of being the predator's next tasty treat. In contrast to this ferocious crocodile, the average Japanese imperial soldier of World War II was around 5 feet 3.5 inches tall and weighed around 120 pounds. He was fanatically dedicated to the emperor, focused and taught that surrender was not an option. He could live on a handful of rice a day, supplemented with what else could be foraged in the surrounding jungle. This could be snakes, rats, or even large spiders. He was normally armed with an Arisaka bolt-action rifle, as well as a 20-inch sword bayonet, both of...
But they would also create their own weapons for hunting, so that they didn't have to wear out their weapons on which were needed for the war.
Which were used to devastating effect, with numerous countries falling to the Japanese Empire at the start of World War II. Between 1941 and 1943, the Japanese soldier was regarded as being near invincible. But soon the Allies' high numbers and better quality equipment began to bring down their fearsome...
Well, a lot of Japanese-made weapons had a tendency to explode in the shooter's face. So that killed a few of them, and because their guns had exploded, they couldn't use them.
...reputation. And with all the chaos and intensity of World War II, it was inevitable that in the Pacific Theater, that troops on both sides would come into contact with vicious saltwater crocodiles with fatal consequences. Such an attack would happen on the island of Ramree, off what was then Burma. In January 1945, the British Army launched Operation Matador in an attempt to recapture several Japanese-held islands and establish air bases there. The Allied attack on Ramree began with a naval bombardment by a task force headed by the British battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth, which could fire 2,000-pound shells up to a distance of 30 miles. This barrage was quickly followed by RAF P-47 Thunderbolts, which strafed the beach ahead of the invasion force. Then the Japanese garrisons were mercilessly bombed by B-24 Liberator heavy bombers.
As you'd expect for an area over there.
Within hours, the Allies exerted complete control of the skies across the whole island, as Grumman F-6F Hellcat naval fighters from the carrier HMS Amir maintained air superiority. Then the Allies' amphibious landing began. Troops made their way through a coastal minefield, landing large numbers of Indian soldiers who were unopposed as they came ashore.
In fact, there were more Indian soldiers in the war than almost any other type of soldier.
But as they moved inland, the fighting began, quickly intensifying as the Japanese forces held out against their advance. 2 weeks later, the island's main town was under attack by Allied troops, supported by tanks. Japanese resistance was now crumbling. The Japanese, totally overwhelmed and outclassed, had been forced to retreat.
If you watch the movie Hacksaw Ridge, you can actually see a similar sort of situation on which is happening here. It's slightly different, but it works in a very similar aspect.
To their fortified strongholds in the hills. The British forces began to flank them, and now the risk of being surrounded was ever growing for the Japanese forces. This already crumbling Japanese garrison had no choice but to abandon their position and retreat. The Japanese commander made the painful and shameful decision to take his 900 men on a 10-mile march through the mangrove swamps to the...
Yes, and as you know, the Japanese say it's better to die for the Empire for the Empire then to die in the hands of your enemy or to surrender. And actually, it meant that doing this would have been a last-ditch attempt to, because a lot of these Japanese officers had that very strongly ingrained into them.
Other side of the island, in the hopes of joining up with the other few remaining Japanese forces. However, the swamp was full of venomous snakes, scorpions, and disease-carrying mosquitoes. And most importantly, it was home to thousands of vicious saltwater crocodiles. Even the locals were afraid to venture into the swamps for fear of falling victim to one of its many predators. Many of the Japanese soldiers were sick or wounded. They were the first to be picked off by the crocodiles as they fell behind the main group. The crocodiles would suddenly appear out of nowhere, dragging its startled victim beneath the water. Once its prey was drowned, the Salty would begin its death roll, ripping the limbs from its prey in a frenzied state. When the splashing ceased, the water would go still and mix with the fresh blood of the latest victim to fall prey to the local apex.
And it was actually so common that some soldiers described the swamps turning a weird red.
Predator. Over the next few days, the Japanese troops made slow progress through the muddy swamp with its thick patches of dense foliage and almost impenetrable mangrove trees. As the days went by, the troops faced fatigue, starvation, and dehydration, which took its toll on the survivors. More and more soldiers started to fall behind the main group, allowing the crocodiles, true to their nature, to opportunistically pick off any stragglers. The crocodiles had now taken to devouring their victims before the very eyes of the soldiers' comrades.
Yep.
Before long, a mask of these predators were attacking the soldiers, tearing them apart and eating them brazenly. One night, the crocodiles would boldly wander into the Japanese camp and snatch an exhausted soldier, dragging him screaming into the swamp. His cries would quickly stop as he was eaten alive.
Yes.
Before long, these highly territorial creatures were seemingly killing for the sheer pleasure of it. Though, being opportunistic predators, it's far more likely they were excited about the abundance of a new food source. Within a week, the days and nights were filled with screams and gunfire, as more soldiers were killed by the crocodile.
And actually, I think they killed it. Some estimates suggest that they killed 4 crocodiles, and over 100 soldiers were killed, roughly.
Eventually, what little remained of the group emerged from the swamp, decimated by the crocs. The Japanese soldiers that had made it out alive frantically attempted an evacuation back to mainland Japan. No one knows the exact number of those who were killed in the swamp, and it has been highly debated. It's thought that at least 500 men perished in the swamp, but the true figure will likely never be known.
But we were also talking about from the crocodiles, not from disease and so on, which is a completely different story because, you know, disease, like measles, was spreading like hay fever in the summer.
On February 17th, the Japanese carried out aerial bombing raids that sunk an Allied destroyer, providing a distraction so a small fleet of rescue craft could evacuate the remaining survivors off the island.
Which made sense.
By February 22nd, the Japanese resistance on Ramree Island came to an end. Ironically, due to unregulated hunting on Ramree in the 1960s, the saltwater crocodile colony is now near extinct there, with only a handful lurking in the mangrove swamp.
But some people still do die to them.
The Great Emu War.
Honestly, this was brilliant.
In Australia in 1932, a strange war would see a conflict between humans and emus.
I would say that there was technically 2 conflicts that happened. 2 wars, if you could even call them a war.
Following the First World War, Australian and British veterans were given plots of land by the government so they could become farmers. These farmers were struggling to grow their crops in the difficult conditions, and the Great Depression had caused wheat prices to fall.
Yes, incredibly,
in 1922, emus, the indigenous soft-feathered birds that are flightless, were a protected species, but they had become classed as vermin when 20,000 of the birds ate crops across.
They would break the fences and then eat them, and then the rabbits in the local area would then eat them as well.
Western Australia. The ex-soldiers turned farmers requested aid from the Australian military, asking the Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, for machine guns and ammunition.
Yes.
Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery led 2 soldiers armed with Lewis light machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition.
And they killed, and it was said that each bird took 10 rounds to kill.
They confidently believed it would be easy to take down the masses of emus at point-blank range with such a weapon. The war was postponed to the 2nd of November because of heavy rainfall. They traveled to the district of Campion, where they sighted around 50 emus and opened fire. However, the speed and ability to scatter into small groups made the emus able to dodge the fire and move out of range.
They kind of just ran in sporadic places so it could never actually be hit directly.
Most got away, and only a handful were killed. 2 days later, they spotted 1,000 emus and planned to ambush the birds. They again scattered and dodged the fire, even at close range, and only 10 emus were killed, and one of the Lewis guns jammed. One of the soldiers said, "The emus have proved that they are not so stupid as they are usually considered to be. Each mob has its leader, always an enormous black plume bird standing fully 6 feet high."
They have a weird social hierarchy on which seems normal to us, but to an animal. But we're talking about animals here, who we often see as stupid and can't formulate ideas.
Keeps watch while his fellows busy themselves with the wheat. At the first suspicious sign, he gives the signal, and dozens of heads stretch up out of the crop. A few birds will take fright, starting a headlong stampede for the scrub, the leader always remaining until his followers have reached safety.
Yep.
The next tactic was to mount one of the Lewis guns on a truck. This failed too because the ride was bumpy and the emus were too fast, making
And the car actually flipped.
accuracy impossible. The idea came to an end when a lone emu got caught in the steering wheel. On November 8th, after the negative media coverage at the humorous failure to cull the emus and discussion in the Australian House of Representatives, the group withdrew. They had used up 25...
It's also their national bird. They tried to kill it. That also doesn't send a good thing out. So there's this joke where, what does your bird mean to you? The US would say bravery and freedom. The UK is their instinct. And Australia, a nuisance.
100 rounds of ammunition and killed just 200 emus. Major G.P.W. Meredith said in retrospect, if we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. A second attempt on the 12th of November was made after more emu attacks on crops. It was more successful, claiming 986 kills using 9,860 rounds at a rate of 10 rounds per confirmed kill.
Exactly.
Given these poor efforts, in the end it was the emus that were victorious in the Great Emu War. It was only after the government introduced bounties on the emus in 1934 that the mass culling was effective. Today,
and then even some people just started breeding them to get the bounties. It was brilliant.
Emus are protected under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999.
The Great Plague of London, 1665 to 1666.
Rats.
In the spring of 1665, an epidemic of the bubonic plague emerged in London, England. The plague began in the parish of St Giles in the Fields, a poor area outside of London's walls.
I've actually been
and
there.
As spring turned to a hot summer, it became an epidemic. The second plague pandemic is speculated to have started in China and spread through Europe through trade. The bubonic plague is caused by...
That seems a little bit weird because of COVID and how it started through China, went to Asia, and went to Europe. It seems like a lot of major pandemics come from China. Actually, maybe that says something about China.
The bacterium Yersinia pestis, which is transmitted by fleas that live on rats. Victims would have symptoms including fever, coughing up blood, and painful buboes, blisters, and bruises on the body. Victims typically died within days of catching the illness.
Roughly about 5 to 7 days.
The poorest areas were the most unsanitary, with rubbish and waste littering the streets, and were therefore the hardest hit by the plague. Doctors were also too expensive for most people, although their treatment was limited in its effectiveness because they thought miasmas, or bad air, was the cause of the plague.
They actually recommended to carry around a bag of lavender and every half an hour to swing it around, put it on the ground and jump over it. It was stupid.
The rich, meanwhile, as they could afford to, fled the city. King Charles II, the nobility, parliament and most...
Went to Oxford, actually, and the place where they stayed was... They had pooped everywhere and never taken a bath, because they said diseases were spread by baths.
Merchants, lawyers and doctors fled, while the poor remained. The Lord Mayor and Aldermen also remained, to keep order and stop the disease spreading further. In June, the Mayor closed the gates of London to people without a certificate of health.
And that is what is happening with China coming into the UK right now.
The roads were bottlenecked from people trying to escape the city. By autumn, 7,000 people were dying from the plague every week in the city. Watchmen were employed to enforce a quarantine. If a person was infected or had died of the plague, their whole family would be locked away with them in their house, sealed from the outside.
Which is very similar to quarantine and lockdown. You can actually see some of the correlations between them, even though they're about 350-year difference.
Kept guard over. A red cross was then painted on the door to distinguish it. Soon enough, the whole family would be infected and would suffer the same way. A common sight was also drivers of dead cars with piles of bodies who moved around the streets calling, "Bring out your dead!" and the dead would be buried in mass graves. As winter came, the spread of disease was slowed down.
Yes.
From December 1665, people started to return to London, and by February 1666, the death toll had decreased to a level that was safe for the king to return. It is estimated that up to 100,000 people died in London from the Great Plague.
And that's London alone. And then you had the Great Fire of London, which just killed more people.
After the Great Plague, the Great Fire of London would again engulf the city in disaster. But it may also have helped kill off some of the rats and fleas carrying the plague.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And we haven't even... Oh, actually, this kind of works in with it, so I may not speak for this because we kind of said everything in the last one.
Plague cures. The Middle Ages.
Oh, strapping chicken bombs to your armpits. That was one. And that was actually a crazy one. Burning all the villagers' cats and dogs. Hiding in the sewer. Placing a gold coin in your mouth as well.
The Black Death. The bubonic plague, more commonly known as the Black Death, due to the black buboes that would swell in the armpits and groins of victims, decimated the population of Europe during the Middle Ages, from 1347 to 1351. These buboes would swell, sometimes as large as an egg, and turn black before eventually rupturing, oozing blood and pus, putting the person in agony. Other symptoms of the plague included fever, rashes, difficulty breathing, and vomiting blood.
And there's about 50 reported cases in the US every year, which is very little compared to some other countries like China, where there's about 100, 200, depending on the year.
We associate the name the Black Death with this initial devastating outbreak, but in reality, the bubonic plague continued to affect and devastate Europe for the next few centuries. During the outbreak, the plague spread rapidly from the Middle East across continental Europe and then jumped the channel to the British Isles. As terror and disease ran rampant throughout Europe, people searched for answers. Some believed that God was punishing the
Yes.
human race for their...
So they would whip themselves for 33 and a quarter, I think it was months, to represent the 33 and a quarter years that Jesus lived.
sins through divine intervention or in the form of the disease. One of the most prominent theories was delivered to the King of France by a respected medical institution in France. They said that the cause of the plague was the conjunction of 3 planets in 1345,
Yes.
which then caused a great pestilence in the air. This was followed by the bad air theory or miasma theory, which became widely
There was also a theory that you could cure it by farting into a pot and then smelling it.
accepted everywhere. However, the Black Death was actually caused by bites from the fleas carried on rats. Due to the high death toll, streets were often littered with bodies that were left outside for the death collectors, as they were to be taken away and buried in mass graves known as plague pits. Life had become so tragic that, as one Italian citizen in 1348, Agnolo di Tura, stated, there was no one who wept for any death, for all
Yeah, because they were dying so often that if they wept, they would never stop.
awaited death. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world.
Yeah, people actually did think that, and there are some art pieces made later on of people panicking and thinking it's the end of the world.
As the death toll
Kind of like when COVID came. You could put a lot of parallels between the Black Death and COVID.
increased and people continued to be struck down by the disease throughout Europe, and entire families were being wiped out, plague doctors began to get desperate and creative with so-called plague cures. These are some of those cures. Bloodletting.
Yeah.
One way physicians and plague doctors attempted to cure the Black Death was through bloodletting. Bloodletting was common during the Middle Ages, as it was believed that it expelled harmful
Also often done on the neck as well.
humors from within the body that were causing the sickness. The practice of bloodletting involved leeching or cutting near to the site of the infection, in this case, the bubo. However, cutting into the skin to drain the blood often led to further infection, as the immune system was already weak and health conditions were unsanitary, given the circumstances.
Well, yeah.
Plague doctors would also sometimes lance the buboes, releasing a putrid odor along with blood and pus. Sweating.
In fact, the sweating cure killed more people than it saved.
Sweating was also a popular cure. In this case, the doctor would provide the patient with medicine that would raise their temperature. The idea was to make the patient sweat out the corruption from the blood that the disease caused.
There was a little bit of stuff behind it because when the immune system decides to attack something, they will increase the body temperature because often bacteria can't survive high body temperatures.
It was seen as a last resort treatment. Treacle. One of the more pleasant ways of curing the plague was to use treacle, a type of syrup made of unrefined sugar.
I like
The
treacle.
catch was that the treacle had to be aged for at least 10 years to be an effective cure for the Black Death. The reasoning behind this cure was that the substance, which by that point would be horrific smelling and very sticky, was going to rid the body of the disease while simultaneously counteracting the effects of the disease.
Yes,
The
but never
treacle was
worked.
drank in its thick, syrupy form and was thought to completely rid the plague from the victim's body. While seemingly improbable, it is possible that over the course of the 10-year aging period that disease-fighting molds may have developed within the treacle that could
Well, penicillin was a disease-fighting mole, so there is some sort of evidence that that could be there, but it's not really too well done. If we could do experiments on it now, then there is a possibility that we could find out if it would work.
help fight off the plague. Whether this saved anyone is largely unknown. bathe in urine.
This didn't work.
Whilst we might find this a disgusting cure by today's clean standards, this isn't altogether unsurprising. Urine was believed to have healing properties and had been
It was also believed to be sterile.
associated with medical issues since the days of Galen and Hippocrates.
Which I guess it is when it first comes out, but as soon as it makes contact with the air, bacteria can and will start growing.
Urine was often examined in flasks by physicians who matched the color and consistency to illustrations. Victims of the plague were given urine to bathe in, with the thought being that it would relieve their symptoms. This was then taken further, and some victims were given urine to drink. Crushed emeralds. Unsurprisingly, this cure was more for the wealthy plague sufferer.
Yeah.
The idea was that swallowing the precious stones would help to restore balance amongst the humors, and therefore cure the victim. Emeralds weren't the only precious jewels used. Other minerals such as pearls were said to be effective. The stones were usually ground down and mixed with water to form a sparkly potation.
But very hard to grind down, and it was basically just like eating rocks.
One that was laced with little bits of emerald that probably felt like broken glass. Covering yourself in human excrement.
Actually, there was a Greek philosopher who died because he drowned in excrement, basically. He had to go in there he used it because he had a condition where there was excess water built up in his body. Overheated and died.
Doctors would make a paste from human feces, flower roots, and some tree resins. The buboes would then be cut open and the paste would be smeared on. The open wound would then be tightly wrapped to keep the paste inside.
This is what I said before.
Live in a sewer. On the face of it, this is a very counterproductive cure. However, medieval doctors thought that the plague was caused by the air. It was thought that the disgusting smells of the sewer would stop the less smelly but disease-ridden air from coming near them, and therefore infecting them. Sadly, not only was it a disgusting cure, it also wasn't very effective, as it often exposed victims to a variety of other nasty diseases.
And the rats in there anyway would have just given them a higher dose of Yersinia pestis.
Whipping yourself. The Middle Ages were a particularly religious time, and it's no wonder that people turned to God when they got the disease. They thought that it might be God's punishment for being sinful, and that the only way to a cure was to punish themselves.
Yes.
They did this through flagellation. This was where they went into the streets and
They'd also start singing sometimes.
whipped themselves and each other to punish themselves for their sins in the hope that God would cure them. Dinner parties.
This one just made no sense. They just basically acted like the rich.
Some doctors thought that stress made people more susceptible to the plague, so they recommended
He wasn't wrong, really, because stress has been shown to hamper your immune system.
eating their meals with others in order to promote merrymaking and reduce stress. In Florence, Marchione di Capostefani describes how people used to take turns to host the dinners, although often 2 or 3 people wouldn't turn up. This cure helped to spread the plague more because of close contact with the infected. The live chicken cure. This may be the most puzzling of the plague cures. During the medieval period into the 18th century, a popular cure was the live chicken cure, or the Vickery method. The live chicken treatment included taking a rooster, plucking its backside, and placing its rump onto the buboes of the plague victim. Supposedly, the bare chicken would draw out the poison in the buboes, therefore curing the plague victim of the terrible disease. The live chicken treatment was so popular throughout Europe that it was integrated into normal medical procedures for the plague victims by the 16th century. Some physicians believed that the heat from the chicken was what drew the poison from the buboes, while others simply believed the chicken balanced the humors within the body. quarantine. The most tried and true of the cures.
And this one actually did work and is still used for pandemics to this day, as you found out 3 years ago. Almost exactly 3 years ago.
Was the use of quarantine, which had begun to be implemented in Italy in 1348. Quarantine policies required that individuals, even entire families, be confined to or shut up in their homes until they had recovered from the plague, and then be confined for a further 40 days afterwards. For many, that recovery never happened. Bodies littered the streets in front of the isolated houses. For when a family member died in quarantine, they would be left on the doorstep to be taken away to the plague pits. While plague quarantine policies did work in some ways, the death toll in London was still high at around 10,400 people, 7.5% of the city's population in 1636. Of course, these cures were not very successful, and eventually the Black Death just went away. Later, it would return time and time again across the next few centuries.
But
As
of
time
course
went
it would.
on and medicine became more refined, doctors began to understand what remedies worked and why. Sanitation and
Like, COVID will come back. We all know it. But we just don't know when.
quarantine became more and more important as cures, while others, such as flagellation, became less prominent. You might wonder why these cures were ever tried and if people really believe them to work. The answer is yes. Physicians and patients really believed that these cures were the right thing to do in stopping the plague. It is
They probably just didn't know, because medical knowledge was still quite new at this point. They probably didn't know much about it.
likely that the cures became widespread because someone tried them and it appeared to work. Word would spread and more people would try them. That means there were probably more crazy cures that were out there that we don't know about. The plague that made people dance until they
Yeah, this was in France. Because, of course, it was in France.
died. Medieval Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries. Europe during the Middle Ages was a time of great hardships. Nearly endless wars led to frequent famines. As the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously said, life, particularly for the peasantry, was unusually nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
One of the peculiar ways in which it appears the peasantry of the Middle Ages dealt with these hardships was through a bizarre phenomenon known as choreomania. The term is derived from the Greek words choros, meaning to dance, and mania, meaning madness or compulsion.
Yep.
Historical records from the 14th to the 17th century documents periods of dancing mania so frequently that they can't be dismissed as mere rumor or
It was we think it was either a disease or a brain disorder.
exaggeration. Outbreaks of this so-called dancing mania involved groups of people dancing erratically and uncontrollably, sometimes in their hundreds or even thousands. Like a disease, the mania would spread from town to town and even country to country as if it were contagious. Historical records are sometimes very
And they'd sometimes, even in cities, they'd sometimes put bands out in the city centre just so that they'd dance to it.
detailed about these outbreaks, which affected men, women, and children, dancing often until they collapsed from exhaustion or injuries. The first sparsely recorded outbreak of dancing mania is actually from the 11th century, where on Christmas Eve in 1021, people are said to have danced en masse in the German town of Kölbeck.
Yes.
A couple hundred years later in Erfurt, another incident was recorded, and around the same time in
I think they broke the bridge in this case.
it was said that 200 people fell to their death while dancing on a bridge that collapsed under their weight. However, the first well-documented outbreak of dancing mania was in 1374 in the German town of Aachen. For reasons that are unclear, the people of Aachen started to dance involuntarily. They moved frantically until near the point of total exhaustion.
Yeah, and they couldn't physically stop. Even if they tried, they wouldn't be able to. So it was their only choice but to carry on.
Within weeks, this strange compulsion has spread like the plague to the Netherlands and northeast of France. Hundreds of people uncontrollably jumped, leapt, and twitched for days. Another well-documented outbreak happened 150 years later in France. There was a woman called Frau Trofea who started dancing in the city of Strasbourg in July of 1518 for weeks on end. She was gradually joined by more and more people, and the situation escalated when the city authorities provided a stage and hired musicians in hope of bringing the bizarre crisis to an end. Once the first dancers started their strange ritual, however, others joined in, claiming to be overwhelmed by a compulsion. A manuscript in the city's archive of the time offers a glimpse of the scale of the epidemic that followed. It reads, "There has been a strange epidemic lately going amongst the folk, so that many in their madness began dancing, which they kept up day and night without interruption until they fell unconscious. Many have died of it."
Yes.
While seemingly improbable, dozens of medieval sources from different towns mention both the 1374 and the 1518 incidents. The latter was even mentioned in the city of Strasbourg's municipal orders, and it is clear from these records that during both incidents, the people afflicted by this dancing mania were not simply shaking from some unknown plague, but actually dancing, albeit involuntarily. They were obviously in great physical and mental pain as well. The records detail that most of those with dancing mania also had horrible hallucinations and could be heard praying for absolution in the middle of their dancing fits. Often they barely ate or slept, and sometimes they were not even fully conscious of their actions.
Yeah.
The theories of what actually happened to cause these epidemics varied across the centuries. Some blamed religious beliefs and demonic possession. Others suggested the existence of a dancing cult, while others blamed them on mass poisonings, which caused hallucinations and shaking.
Which
One
wasn't
of the most
surprising.
bizarre and yet widespread contemporary explanations was that the dancing mania was brought on by a curse from St. John the Baptist, or in other places, St. Vitus.
Which was extremely weird, but for religious people at the time kind of made sense. Which is weird how still some people would think that that makes sense.
Why or how either of these dead saints could have made such a curse is unclear, but so common was the belief that in many places the dancing mania was actually named after them, as in St. John's Dance or St. Vitus's Dance.
And was seen as cleansing out your sins.
In Italy, the dancing mania was sometimes called tarantism, and it was believed to be brought on by either a spider bite or a dangerous poison. Later on, as medical science evolved, a similar condition to dancing mania was labeled Sydenham chorea, but this disorder was thought to only affect children, causing them to have involuntary tremors in the arms, legs, and face. In 1888, a German gentleman named Justus Friedrich Karl Hecke wrote a fairly comprehensive account of the dancing mania phenomenon entitled The Black Death and the Dancing Mania. In it, he imaginatively describes what he calls St. John's Dance as follows. They formed circles hand in hand and, appearing to have lost all control over their senses, continued dancing, regardless of the bystanders, for hours together in wild delirium, until at length they fell to...
And until they collapsed from exhaustion, they would not stop. Until they died, they would not stop.
...the ground in a state of exhaustion. They then complained of extreme oppression and groaned, which they again recovered and remained free from complaint until the next attack. Modern researchers believe the outbreaks were most likely examples of mass psychogenic illness triggered by fear and depression.
Probably.
Both of the most well-documented manias of 1374 and 1518 were preceded by particularly bad periods of devastating famine, crop failures, and disease. Anxiety and fear combined with...
And often now also seen is, these days, is it's still happening, just not en masse, but on with certain individuals, which kind of perpetuates this somewhat.
Religious belief that such hardships were the result of God punishing them for their wrongdoing made people, according to this theory, susceptible to mass delusions that may have gave them some reprieve from their dire situations. Ultimately, this too is just an educated guess. What is for sure, however, is that diagnosing a mass contagion from 500 years ago is not easy.
Well, no.
We will probably never know what exactly caused the dancing mania of the Middle Ages, but the urge to dance away one's troubles isn't all that strange if you think about it. Swine and punishment. The pigs tried for murder.
Yes, so a pig was tried for the murder of a boy in France, because France.
Medieval France, 1200 to 1750. Over 500 years ago,
I'm not going to speak for this one because I think the way that he explains it perfectly.
Small French village of Savigny was rocked by a horrific tragedy.
Savigny.
Unaware of the coming danger, a 5-year-old boy happily played alone in the street. But then, out of nowhere, a group of attackers accosted the young child, tearing off his head and arms without hesitation. It was broad daylight, and the bold killers made no attempt to conceal their crime. It sounds like something out of a TV detective drama, except for one striking feature. The perpetrators were pigs.
Yep.
Specifically, the ringleader was a sow, accompanied by her 6 piglets. The villagers were naturally appalled by the horrible event, but it didn't end there. All 7 pigs were arrested and put through a criminal trial as if they were human beings. Although the pig's owner was initially arrested too, the judge ruled that he was not liable for the pig's action. That left just the pigs to be indicted for murder. They were kept in prison while awaiting trial. After all, the village didn't want a murderous gang on the loose. The entire process played out exactly how it would have in a human trial, with attorneys arguing for the defense and prosecution.
Even though there was really no defense, there was no real thing for the defense because they were pigs.
The piglets got off lightly due to their age and lack of evidence proving they were active participants in the crime. However, because their original owner was not willing to guarantee their future good behavior, they were forfeited to Catherine du Barneau, Lady of Savigny.
Yes.
As for their mother, the case was pretty open and shut, with over 9 witnesses testifying against her. Their evidence was only compounded by the sow's disrespectful behavior in court. Unapologetically, she grunted, squealed, and tried to poke her nose through the bars in the prisoner's box. There were no mitigating circumstances that would have softened her punishment. After spending nearly a month in jail, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Within days, she was publicly hanged from a tree by her hind legs alongside other condemned criminals. While this may seem like a bizarre occurrence, animal trials were fairly common in medieval and early modern France. Between the 10th and
Yeah, I don't know why, but France has some weird laws when it comes to pigs.
18th centuries,
Like, you can't name your pig Napoleon.
over 100 animal trials took place. Sometimes a swarm of locusts would be tried for trespassing and the destruction of crops. Other times, a horse would be charged for sodomy. Overwhelmingly, though, it was pigs being tried for murder. This raises a couple of questions. Firstly, why were pigs so bloodthirsty? During the Middle Ages, it was normal to see pigs roaming free in the streets.
Yeah.
In these rural communities, parents felt comfortable allowing their children to explore outside unattended. Unlike the large cities of today, people knew and trusted their neighbors, and there were no modern dangers such as cars to watch out for. That didn't make it entirely safe, though. As the pig trials show, danger was never as far away as it seemed.
Well,
There were situations where small children would come into contact with pigs, and sometimes those pigs had a taste for human flesh.
very
Of course,
rarely.
even large pigs couldn't take on fully grown adults, so their victims were usually very young. Take another infamous sow who sparked public outrage in 1567
Yeah.
when she snacked on a 4-month-old girl sleeping in her cot. So that's how it happened. But why did the courts even bother putting pigs through formal trials? Well, historians disagree on the reason. One popular theory is that this was how folk communities restored order after an unsettling event occurred. By reframing the unforeseeable accident as the decision of a rational actor, they could understand the tragedy and create a sense of justice. Others speculate that these public trials and executions were meant to serve as a warning to parents that they shouldn't leave their children unattended. Just like human offenders, criminal pigs were paraded around the streets in carts on the way to their executions.
I
They
always,
were sometimes
I always found it weird how France seems to treat their pigs better than their humans.
Dressed in human clothes and were hanged in front of an audience. In case anybody missed the live event, they could still see the pig's corpse swaying in the wind for days after the execution. It certainly sent a message. Some scholars dismiss those theories as absurd, however, emphasizing how bizarre and cruel the whole process was. They see it as making a parody of the law, an example of humans extending their authority to every aspect of life on Earth by brute force. No matter the explanation, animal trials spread to nearby parts of Italy, Switzerland, and the Low Countries from the 15th century. But by the 18th century, animal trials were on the decline. During the Enlightenment, there was a revival in Roman law across Europe,
Yes.
which held that animals were not rational and so couldn't be tried for crimes. Over time, European legal systems came to resemble our modern courts, where only humans, not pigs, could be tried for murder.
Anyway, it's the end of the video, so remember to like, subscribe and all that, and I'll see you in the next video.